The trauma bay went dead quiet. A nurse stumbled backward from the gurney, hands trembling, eyes locked on the patient bleeding out in front of her. Around her, the ER at Riverside Medical Center churned with noise and movement. Monitors screaming, gurneys rattling, staff shouting across each other. But in that one frozen second, everyone saw her freeze. Dr. Ethan Cross saw it too. "Get her out of my trauma room," he said, loud enough that 3 other nurses heard it clearly. Nobody defended her. Nobody said a word. 2 hours later, military helicopters cut through the sky over Ashford, and the woman everyone had just laughed at became the only reason dozens of people made it out of that hospital alive. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next, and drop a like if Claire's story deserves to be heard. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The thing about Riverside Medical Center was that it had a reputation, and the reputation meant everything. Ashford wasn't a small city. It sat at the intersection of 3 major highways in the industrial corridor of the Mid-Atlantic region, a place where chemical plants, freight lines, and sprawling distribution centers kept the economy moving and the ER consistently busy. Riverside had been ranked among the top regional trauma centers in the state for 4 consecutive years. The plaques were in the lobby, the press releases were framed. The staff knew what those rankings meant for funding, for prestige, for the kind of recruits the hospital could attract. It also meant that being assigned to Riverside's emergency department carried weight. And carrying weight meant that the people who ran that department, the ones who controlled access, reputation, and the daily rhythm of a unit that never fully stopped, had power that ran deeper than their titles suggested. Dr. Ethan Cross had understood that from his first week as chief of emergency medicine. He was 41, with a sharp jaw and the kind of posture that made people get out of his way in hallways. He had trained at a prestigious program, published research that got cited more than he'd ever admit to caring about, and built a department that ran on precision, or what he called precision, which was closer to control. He was the kind of doctor who genuinely believed that the best trauma teams operated on hierarchy, that decisiveness only flowed downward, and that anyone who couldn't project confidence in a critical moment had no business being in the room. There was a logic to it. There was also a cruelty to it that he either didn't notice or had stopped bothering to examine. Claire Bennett had noticed it on her 3rd shift. She was 29, and she'd joined Riverside's ER 8 months ago after a period that her application materials described carefully and vaguely as military medical service followed by a transition period. Her references were strong. A trauma surgeon in Virginia who'd written a letter that was uncharacteristically brief but unusually direct in tone. A lieutenant colonel whose rank had made the HR coordinator do a small double-take before filing the paperwork. Claire had interviewed well. She'd answered clinical questions cleanly, without hesitation, without the over-explaining that sometimes signaled insecurity. The nurse manager, a woman named Sandra Okafor, had told her after the interview that she thought Claire would be an excellent fit. Sandra had said that before Ethan Cross reviewed the hire. He hadn't objected. He rarely objected to hiring decisions outright, because objections created documentation, and documentation created friction. Instead, what he was very good at doing, was establishing tone. And the tone he established around Claire Bennett, from early on, was one of tolerant skepticism. "She's quiet," he told Sandra the first week, in a way that was almost a question. "She's focused," Sandra said. "She doesn't push back." "She's new." He'd shrugged and walked away, which was somehow more dismissive than if he'd kept arguing. That was the other thing about Ethan Cross. He had a gift for saying very little and making it land like a verdict. Claire had watched all of it and said almost nothing in return. Her shifts were 12 hours, usually nights or the brutal swing between late afternoon and early morning. She was competent at everything she was asked to do. IV placements, wound management, medication protocols, patient monitoring during high-stress resuscitation attempts. She worked fast, but not frantically. She asked questions when she needed to and didn't when she didn't. The other nurses on her shift, Priya Sohn, Marcus Webb, a rotating cast of agency staff who came and went, had mostly settled into a comfortable neutrality with her. She wasn't warm in the way that made people immediately like her. She wasn't cold either. She was simply steady, in a way that didn't translate easily to the social temperature of a busy ER. The problem was that steady in Ethan Cross's department read as flat, and flat in his framework meant something was missing. He first came after her publicly on a Tuesday night, 6 weeks into her time at Riverside. A patient had come in, 53-year-old man, blunt force chest trauma from a construction accident, initial presentation suggesting possible tension pneumothorax. The team moved fast, cross-leading, and in the middle of preparing for needle decompression, he turned and asked Claire, standing at the supply cart, why she hadn't already called for the chest tube tray. "I was waiting for your directive," she said. "You should have anticipated it." The presentation wasn't confirmed yet. He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. In a trauma situation, you don't wait to be told everything. You anticipate. You move. You should know that by now. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then everyone went back to moving, and Claire went back to the cart, and no one said anything. But 3 nurses had heard it, and by the next morning, the exchange had traveled in the particular way that small things travel in hospitals. A sentence here, a shrug there, a recounting at the nursing station that stripped out context and kept the image. Cross had corrected the quiet one again. That was how it started. Over the following months, it followed a pattern. Cross would identify a moment, not always her fault, sometimes legitimately ambiguous, and he would use it to draw a line in the air between her level of competence and what he considered the standard of his department. He never screamed. He never used language that HR would have flagged. He was precise and clinical in his condescension, which made it harder to argue against and easier for bystanders to absorb without comment. "You hesitated on that line placement. Your charting notation is imprecise. If you're not comfortable in a high-pressure environment, there are other departments that might suit you better." That last one he'd said in front of 4 people, including the charge nurse and a medical student rotating through the ER for the week. Claire had looked at him with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away and said, "I'm comfortable here, thank you." He'd made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the opposite and moved on. The medical student had asked Marcus Webb afterward who she was. "That's Claire," Marcus said. "She's—" He paused. "She's good. Don't worry about what just happened." "Does he do that a lot?" Marcus had looked at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "He does it until people leave." The implied question, whether Claire would leave, had been floating around the department for a month before it started feeling like a prediction. Priya Sohn liked Claire for reasons she found hard to articulate when pressed. "She's solid," Priya said once to Marcus, during a slow hour at the nursing station. "Like, actually solid. Not trying to seem solid. I don't know what's underneath it, but whatever it is, it doesn't rattle." "Cross is going to push her out," Marcus said. "Maybe. She won't fight back." Priya looked down the hallway to where Claire was updating a patient chart, standing at the portable terminal with her weight shifted slightly to one leg, her expression calm and focused. "I'm not sure she thinks she needs to," Priya said. That ambiguity, that sense that Claire was waiting on something, or had already made some private calculation that the rest of them couldn't see, was part of what made her hard to read. She wasn't passive in a way that suggested defeat. She was patient in a way that suggested she knew something about time that they didn't. The incident that broke everything open in the wrong direction happened on a Thursday. A patient, 17-year-old male, motorcycle accident, significant road rash, and a deep laceration on his left thigh that was bleeding aggressively, had come in with his mother, who was barely holding together in the waiting area. The boy, whose name was Devin, was scared and in pain and not cooperating with the initial assessment. He kept moving. He kept pulling his arm away from the IV attempt. He was verging on combative in the way that frightened teenagers in pain sometimes become combative. Not violent, just unreachable, locked inside his fear. Claire had been assigned to his bay. She'd tried once, twice to get him to hold still, speaking in the low, direct way she always used with patients, and he'd pulled away again and knocked the tray table, which sent a kidney basin clattering to the floor. A second nurse, agency staff, a woman named Jolene who'd been working at Riverside for 3 days, backed up reflexively, and in backing up caught Claire's arm and pulled her off balance. That was the moment Cross walked in. What he saw: a knocked-over tray, a distressed patient, Two nurses who appeared to have stepped back from the gurney. What he understood, exactly what he wanted to understand. What is happening in here? His voice was quiet and precise, which was always worse than loud. Patient was combative, Jolene said quickly. He knocked. I was talking to Bennett. Cross looked at Claire. Why aren't you at his side? I stepped back for 2 seconds because 2 seconds in a bleeding patient can be the difference between... I'm aware of what 2 seconds means, Claire said. Her voice didn't rise, but something in it shifted. A very slight change in register, so subtle that only someone paying close attention would have caught it. Cross caught it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only she and the agency nurse could hear, You froze. Again. He turned to Devin and took over the assessment himself, and did so with the efficiency and confidence that reminded everyone in the room why he had the title he had. The laceration was packed and stabilized in under 4 minutes. Devin calmed down. The tray was replaced. Cross left without another word. But afterward, standing in the medication room with her back against the cabinet, Claire pressed both palms flat against the cool metal surface and held them there for a few seconds. It wasn't distress, exactly. It was something more controlled than that. The deliberate act of a person grounding herself, redistributing something that had built up past a certain level. Priya found her there. You okay? Fine. He said you froze. You didn't freeze. I know. Priya studied her. Why don't you say something to Sandra or to... Because it wouldn't change anything right now, Claire said. And I don't need it to. Priya wanted to push on that, but something in Claire's tone closed the door on the conversation. Not rudely, just firmly. The way a door closes when someone has made up their mind. 2 weeks later, Cross made a formal recommendation to Sandra that Claire be considered for reassignment to the medical surgical floor. He framed it as a development opportunity. That was the language he used, development opportunity. And it was almost impressive in its precision. He cited observable difficulty managing high acuity cases under pressure, and a pattern of hesitation during critical moments, and feedback from colleagues suggesting concerns about team integration. None of it was an outright lie. All of it was architecture built on selected moments stripped of context, weighted toward a conclusion he'd already reached. Sandra called Claire in. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Sandra was professional and careful. She had run an ER nursing staff long enough to know when she was being used as a vehicle for someone else's agenda, and she didn't like it. But she also didn't have a clear counterargument, because Claire's documented performance was technically clean but not exceptional, and Cross had organizational authority she couldn't easily override. I want you to know I don't think this reflects the whole picture, Sandra said. I appreciate that, Claire said. Do you want to... you can push back on this. You have that right. Claire looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Is the transfer effective immediately? Sandra blinked. He's requesting a 2-week transition, but Claire... Okay, Claire said. Thank you for telling me directly. She walked out of Sandra's office and back onto the floor and finished the rest of her shift without mentioning it to anyone. By the end of the night, Marcus and Priya had heard. Priya was furious in the low, contained way she was furious about things that mattered to her. Marcus was quieter, which was worse. She's not going to fight it, Priya said. I know, Marcus said. She should fight it. Maybe she has a plan we don't know about. Like what? Marcus shook his head. I don't know, but she doesn't seem scared. The next 9 days passed in the particular rhythm of a countdown that only one person knows is counting. Claire worked her shifts. She was efficient and professional. Cross barely looked at her during rounds, which was its own kind of statement. The ER staff moved around the new reality the way water moves around an obstacle, adapting, not addressing. On the 10th morning at 6:47 a.m., the city of Ashford changed. The Hartwell chemical tanker, a 60-foot rig carrying a partial load of industrial oxidizing compounds, had been traveling northbound on Route 9 when its rear axle failed on an overpass section above the interchange of 2 major arteries. The vehicle jackknifed, crossed 2 lanes, and went through the guard barrier. It didn't fall. It hung partially, the cab suspended above the lower roadway, while the tank ruptured along a welded seam and began releasing a visible vapor cloud. The secondary explosion came 40 seconds later, when a panel van attempting to avoid the wreckage clipped a concrete divider and its fuel tank caught. The overpass carried morning commuter traffic. There were 61 vehicles on or adjacent to the span at the time of the first impact. The vapor cloud, depending on wind direction, could reach a quarter-mile radius before diluting to safe levels. It was 6:47 in the morning. Riverside Medical Center's emergency dispatch line lit up 3 minutes later. The first call came from a firefighter on scene, relaying preliminary casualty estimates that were already being revised upward as he spoke. The ER charge nurse who took the call, a veteran named Terrence Flood, who had worked mass casualty situations twice before in his career, pulled the mass casualty activation protocol and called Sandra Okafor at home before he'd even hung up. Sandra was in her car in 4 minutes. She called Cross on the way. "How many?" Cross asked. "Estimates are 30 to 50 critical or serious. Chemical exposure complicating everything. They're routing all of them here. Mercy General is on diversion." A pause. "I'm 12 minutes out. We need to activate the surge protocol now." "Do it. I'll be there." And the ER at that hour was operating with a skeleton early morning staff, 3 nurses on floor assignment, 2 residents, 1 attending covering until the day shift came in. The night shift had just turned over. Several nurses were still in the locker room. The attending on duty, Dr. Yusuf Bakr, a second-year resident who was technically the most senior physician in the building for the next 11 minutes, looked at Terrence Flood when the activation alarm sounded and said, with genuine steadiness given his age and experience level, "Okay, what do we need first?" Claire Bennett was in the locker room changing out of her civilian clothes into scrubs when the alarm sounded. She stopped with one arm in a sleeve and stood still for exactly 3 seconds, head tilted slightly, listening to the overhead announcement playing through the intercom. "Mass casualty activation. All available clinical staff report to emergency department." She finished pulling on the scrubs. By the time she came through the ER doors, the first ambulance was already pulling into the bay, and then the second one arrived 30 seconds behind it, and then the third. The noise level in the department went from elevated to overwhelming inside of 4 minutes. Gurneys were moving. Voices overlapped. Someone was calling for imaging. Someone else was shouting about the decontamination protocol. A nurse Claire didn't recognize, from another floor, responding to the activation, stood in the center of the trauma bay looking at the incoming stream of patients with an expression that was 2 degrees away from paralysis. Claire looked at the board. She looked at the patients arriving. She looked at the staff positioned around the room and calculated, in the way she calculated, who was where and what was being done and what wasn't. Dr. Bakker was at the first gurney, working, focused. Good. The second gurney, a woman in her 40s, significant facial and upper body burns, vapor inhalation, showing early signs of respiratory compromise, had a nurse taking vitals and no physician. The third gurney, a man, possibly mid-50s, legs crushed from vehicle impact, tourniquet applied in the field, but already showing saturation through the gauze, had nobody. Claire moved to the third gurney. "Sir," she said, already pulling on gloves. "I'm Claire. I'm your nurse. I need you to look at me." The man's eyes found hers. He was in significant pain. He was also frightened in the specific animal way that people get frightened when they understand, somewhere under the shock, that they might actually die. "Am I?" he started. "You're here," she said. "That's what matters right now. I need to assess this leg. I'm going to press here. Tell me when it changes." Her hands were already moving. Behind her, Cross came through the ambulance bay doors. He stopped for half a second, long enough to read the room, long enough to see the scope of what was incoming, long enough to understand that this was unlike anything Riverside's ER had handled in the last 2 years. Then he moved to the center of the floor and began directing. He was good under pressure. That was the thing about Cross that even people who disliked him couldn't honestly deny. He was technically excellent, and he had the clinical authority to move people and resources in ways that mattered. He called for the surge team. He assigned bays. He made decisions about triage priority that were, in the main, correct. But there were 31 patients incoming, with more behind them, and the resource gap was real and immediate and visible to anyone doing the math. 12 minutes in, a patient in Bay 4 went into cardiac arrest. Cross moved to Bay 4. That was the right call. He was the most experienced physician in the room, and the arrest required him, which meant that for the next several minutes, the rest of the department was running on the senior resident and whatever clinical judgment the nursing staff could bring to bear. And what happened in those minutes was the thing that nobody in Riverside's ER would fully be able to describe afterward in a way that captured what it felt like to watch. Claire Bennett stopped being a nurse. Not literally, she was still a nurse, still bound by the scope of practice, still working within the structure of what a nurse does in an emergency department. But the way she moved through the room changed. The way she spoke changed. There was a quality to her presence that was different, focused in a way that had nothing tentative about it, directional in a way that didn't wait for permission. "Priya," she said, appearing at Priya's elbow. "The woman in Bay 2 is going into respiratory failure. She needs suction, and she needs a physician to look at intubation. Get Bakker." Priya looked at her. "Go," Claire said. "Now." Priya went. Claire moved to the far end of the department where 2 agency nurses had a patient, a teenage boy, chemical burns to his arms and torso, and were debating audibly which dressing protocol to use. "Sterile saline flush first," Claire said, not slowing down. "Cover with non-adherent, no pressure on the chest wall. Move." She didn't wait to see if they followed. She was already at the next bay. The man with the crushed legs had been stabilized enough to hold, but his pressure was dropping in a way that the numbers on the monitor told her before his face did. She adjusted the fluid rate. She called across the room for a specific medication. She got it, checked it, administered it, and was already moving before the bag was fully running. From across the room, Cross, finished with the arrest, patient back in rhythm, watched her. He didn't say anything, but he watched. 37 minutes into the mass casualty event, with 14 patients still to be fully assessed and the department running at a volume it wasn't designed for, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies, with a single moment that everyone recognizes simultaneously. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of shift that happens when a room full of people under pressure slowly, almost invisibly, orients itself around whoever is giving them the clearest signal. And the clearest signal was coming from Claire. Marcus noticed it first because Marcus had been watching her all morning with the particular attention of someone who had spent months wondering what was underneath the stillness. "She's running triage," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Priya was too busy to respond, but she heard it. At the nursing station, Terrence Flood was coordinating incoming ambulance communications, and he kept looking up from his radio to track where in the room Claire was, because whenever something critical was about to escalate, she was already there, 2 steps ahead of the announcement. Cross moved to her side at one point, the woman in Bay 2, now intubated, requiring post-procedure monitoring. "What's her pressure?" 88/56, up from 72 6 minutes ago. She's responding. He looked at the chart. He looked at the patient. He looked at the notation Claire had made in the record. Terse, precise, in the shorthand of someone who had written these notes in worse conditions than this. He started to say something and stopped. His face did something complicated. Outside on the roof and on the access road behind the emergency bay, the sound came first. A heavy, rhythmic thudding that cut through the ambulance noise and the city noise and the layered chaos of the morning. Marcus heard it and looked up. Terrence Flood heard it and went to the window. The 2 military helicopters came in low over the Ashford skyline, moving with the deliberate precision of aircraft that knew exactly where they were going. They weren't medical transport. Anyone who knew what to look for could see that. The markings, the configuration, the way they held formation. They landed in the hospital's secondary helipad, which was normally used for air ambulance transfers, and hadn't had military aircraft on it in anyone's recent memory. 4 men in uniform got out of the first helicopter. They walked directly toward the emergency department entrance, not to the administrative building, not to the public entrance, directly to the emergency department, which meant they knew the layout, which meant somebody had told them, which meant they had come here knowing who they were looking for. The doors opened. The lead officer, tall, composed, a rank insignia on his collar that made the security guard at the door step back automatically, scanned the room. His eyes stopped. Claire had her back to the entrance. She was at a gurney in the center of the floor, talking a resident through a procedure, her voice low and even and absolutely certain. The officer said her name. Not Nurse Bennett, not a question. He said her name the way people say the names of people they have been looking for. Claire turned around. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that wasn't part of the controlled, steady expression the Riverside ER had come to expect from her. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was closer to recognition, the look of someone who has been carrying something for a long time, and who can see now that the weight of it is about to change. She handed the chart to the resident beside her. "Finish the assessment," she said quietly. "You know what to do." She walked across the floor toward the officer. Around her, the ER kept moving. Gurneys, monitors, voices, the constant motion of a unit in crisis. But something had changed in the room. Several nurses had stopped what they were doing for a fraction of a second. Cross had turned from his position at the far bay. Sandra, who had arrived 10 minutes ago and had been watching the floor with the expression of someone recalibrating everything she thought she understood about one of her nurses, went very still. The officer reached out and shook Claire's hand with the particular formality of people who know each other from a context no one else in the room shares. "Major Bennett," he said. The room heard it. Major. Cross heard it from across the emergency department, and his face did something that no one there had ever seen it do before. It went uncertain. The word landed in the room like something physical. Major. Not a title anyone had assigned to her here. Not a rank that appeared anywhere on her Riverside employee badge or her nursing license or the personnel file that Cross had reviewed when building his case for her reassignment. It was a word from a different life, spoken in a register that had nothing to do with the fluorescent-lit, bleach-smelling world of an emergency department, and yet it filled the room with a precision that made everything else in it suddenly feel smaller. Claire didn't correct him. She didn't explain. She shook the officer's hand. His name was Colonel David Marsh, though no one in the department knew that yet, and said something to him quietly, too quiet for anyone more than 3 feet away to catch, and then she glanced back over her shoulder at the ER floor. Not at Cross, at the patients. "I need 5 more minutes," she told Marsh. He nodded once, which was not the response of a man accustomed to waiting, but which he gave without hesitation. She turned back to the floor. And here was the thing that would stay with people later. When they tried to describe what the morning had been, she didn't change. There was no visible shift, no adjustment for the audience, no awareness of the 30-something eyes that were now tracking her movements with a different quality of attention than they had an hour ago. She walked back to the gurney she'd left, checked the resident's work, corrected one thing with a short sentence and no apology for the correction, moved to the next bay, checked a pressure reading, called across the room for a medication adjustment, and did all of it exactly as she'd been doing it for the past 40 minutes. As if the helicopters hadn't landed, as if a colonel in full uniform wasn't standing 12 feet away watching her work, as if the word major hadn't just rewritten everything everyone in that room thought they knew about her. Cross was the one who looked altered. He stood at his position near the central workstation with the particular stillness of a man who has just received information that doesn't fit anywhere in the structure he's built, and who hasn't yet decided what to do about that. His jaw was set. His arms were at his sides. He was watching Claire move through his department, through the department he ran, the one he had been in the process of removing her from. And his face held the expression of someone doing difficult arithmetic. Sandra Okafor stood near the nursing station and watched both of them and said nothing. She had been in healthcare management for 19 years. She knew how to read a room, and what she was reading right now she filed carefully because she understood, with a certainty that felt almost physical, that this morning was not over, and that whatever was about to happen would require her to have a clear account of what she had seen. Priya was moving too fast to stop and process anything fully, but she caught Marcus's eye across the bay, and the look they exchanged was brief and loaded and mutual. "Did you know? No. Did you? No." And then they both went back to work because there were still patients crashing, and the abstract drama of whatever was happening on the other side of the room was secondary to the man in Bay 6, whose oxygen saturation had just dropped 4 points. Claire finished her 5 minutes. It was closer to 7, and she didn't apologize for that either. She crossed the floor to where Marsh was waiting, and the 3 officers with him came into a loose practice configuration around her. Not protective exactly, but oriented toward her in the way that people orient toward someone they're accustomed to deferring to. It was a body language that Cross recognized, because he spoke that language himself, and it landed on him in a way he didn't have time to fully process. "We can use the family consultation room," Sandra said from across the room. Her voice was steady and professional and had the quality of someone who has decided to take ownership of a situation before it takes ownership of her. Marsh looked at her. "Thank you." They moved down the corridor. Claire went with them. Before she turned the corner, she stopped and looked back at the floor. A single, sweeping assessment, the kind she'd been doing all morning, and found Marcus's eyes. "The man in Bay 3 needs a surgeon," she said, clear enough to carry. "The wound's controlled, but there's internal involvement they haven't imaged yet. Don't let it wait." Marcus said, "Got it," without asking how she knew, because by that point he had stopped questioning what she knew and started just writing it down. She turned the corner. The door to the family consultation room closed. In the ER, the silence lasted about 4 seconds before the monitors pulled everyone back to work. But the shape of the morning had changed, and everyone felt it, and the work they did in the next half hour had a different texture to it, quieter, more careful, the kind of focus that comes not from panic, but from the particular attentiveness of people who are waiting for something without knowing exactly what. Cross was the last one to move. He stood at the central workstation for another moment after everyone else had reoriented, and then he looked at the door at the end of the corridor, and then he looked at the floor around him, at the organized, functioning, not yet collapsing emergency department that was running at a volume it shouldn't have been able to handle with the staff it had, and he thought about how it had gotten to this point and who had put it there. He picked up a chart and went back to work. But his movements, for the first time since Claire had known him, were not entirely certain. What? The consultation room was small. 4 chairs, a low table, a box of tissues nobody touched. Marsh sat across from Claire, the other officers flanking him but slightly back, which told her this wasn't a formal military matter. It was something else. "We need to debrief you," Marsh said. "The Callaway operation. There's been a congressional inquiry. They're reviewing the medical records from the extraction, and your name is in the documentation." "I'm aware of what my name is in," Claire said. "The inquiry committee wants a statement. They've been trying to reach you through the VA contacts for 6 weeks. I changed addresses twice. I wasn't hiding." Marsh looked at her for a moment. "Nobody thinks you were hiding, Major." "I'm not a major anymore, Colonel. I'm a nurse." He didn't argue with the title, but the way he looked at her said he found the distinction incomplete. "You still hold the rank. You know that. Administratively, not functionally. But the distinction matters less than you think in a congressional inquiry." He set a folder on the table between them, thin, sealed with a classification marker. "We need you in Washington, 3 days from now, possibly sooner depending on the committee's schedule." Claire looked at the folder and didn't touch it. "I'm in the middle of a mass casualty event." "I'm aware." "Then you know I'm not leaving this building until those patients are stable." Marsh studied her. He was a man who had spent 30 years in situations that required accurate readings of other people, and what he read in Claire Bennett right now was something he recognized without being able to fully name, the particular quality of someone for whom duty had never been theoretical. "We'll wait," he said. "You'll wait a while." "We brought lunch," said one of the other officers, younger, a captain, with the slightly startled expression of someone still recalibrating his understanding of who was in the room. Marsh gave him a look, and he subsided. Claire almost smiled. "Not quite." "I'll come find you when we're clear," she said, and stood up. She was back on the floor in 45 seconds. What happened in the next 2 hours was the kind of work that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked like controlled motion and quiet decisions, and a lot of very fast walking between bays. 3 more ambulances arrived in the first 20 minutes, bringing the total patient count to 38. Of those, 11 were critical, 14 serious, the rest significant enough to require intervention, but stable enough to queue. Cross managed the critical cases. He was good at it. That was still true, and in the compressed urgency of a mass casualty event, his clinical skill was real, and it mattered. But the department was too large and the patient load too heavy for any single physician to hold all of it, and the coordination problem, so who was where, what each patient needed next, where the resource gaps were, what was about to tip before the numbers showed it. That problem required something different from clinical excellence. It required a kind of spatial awareness, a capacity to hold the whole room in your mind simultaneously and read the patterns before they became crises. That was what Claire did. That was what she kept doing for 2 hours, without acknowledgement, without direction from above, and without the title that would have made it legible to anyone watching who didn't already understand what they were seeing. The resident, Dr. Yusuf Bakr, figured it out first, partly because he was the one working closest to her, and partly because he was young enough not to have developed the defensive hierarchies that made it harder to notice. He started checking with her before making decisions, not because she outranked him, but because she was consistently right, and he was smart enough to recognize that, and pragmatic enough to use it. "This patient," he said, Bay 8, a woman with a pressure that had been stable for 40 minutes but had just shifted. "She's compensating." "She's been compensating since she came in," Claire said, not looking up from the chart she was reviewing. "Her mental status has been slightly altered since the field report. Call for imaging now." "Not in 15 minutes." Baker called for imaging. The scan showed a small but significant intracranial bleed. The neurosurgeon was called. The patient went to surgery within the hour. She survived, but not because anyone had caught it in time through the normal flow. She survived because Claire had been tracking her mental status from the moment she came through the doors and hadn't let the stable pressure numbers override what she was seeing in the patient's eyes. These were the moments that didn't get recorded, not in the way that would show up on a chart or in a debrief or in anyone's official account of the morning. They were woven into the outcome: patients who didn't crash, calls that were made in time, cascades that were interrupted before they became irreversible, and the only way to know they'd happened was to have been in the room. Sandra had been in the room. She had a legal pad with her, which she'd brought out of habit and which she'd filled with more notes than she usually took in a full week. Not clinical notes, she wasn't tracking patient outcomes. She was tracking decisions, tracking who made them, when, and what happened next. It was the habit of someone who understood documentation, who understood that what you could prove after the fact was only as good as what you had written down in the moment. At one point, Cross came to the workstation while she was writing and glanced at the pad. "Patient tracking?" he said. "Something like that," Sandra said, and turned the page. He looked at her for a moment, the same look he'd given Claire when she'd said something that didn't land where he expected, and then moved away. Around noon, the incoming ambulance volume dropped to 0. The highway overpass had been cleared, the remaining injured had been transported, and the chemical hazmat team had contained the vapor spread enough that secondary casualties had been limited. The ER was still running at surge capacity, would be for hours yet, but the acute intake phase was over. Cross called a brief departmental pause. Everyone who could step back for 3 minutes did. Water, a breath, a moment to stop running. Claire was at the nursing station updating charts. She didn't stop. Priya came and stood next to her with 2 cups of water and put one down without asking. Claire picked it up and drank half of it without taking her eyes off the screen. "You doing okay?" Priya asked. "I'm doing okay." "You should probably eat something." "After the charts." Priya watched her for a moment. She wanted to say something. There were several things queued up, things that had been building since the morning, since the word major had landed in the room and rearranged everything. But she also knew Claire well enough by now to know that the middle of a work task was not the moment. "Okay," she said instead. She didn't move away. Claire glanced up. "What?" "Nothing, just—" Priya stopped. "I've been watching you all morning." "I know. You've done this before. Like actually done this before, not in a simulation." Claire looked back at the screen. "Yes." "Where?" A pause that lasted 2 seconds, which was a long time for Claire. "Places that don't have names I can use in this building." Priya absorbed that. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said again, differently this time. She finally moved away. At 12:34 p.m., Cross came to the nursing station. He stood next to Claire with the particular body language of a man who has been working up to something and has decided now is the moment. He put his hands on the counter. He looked straight ahead rather than at her. "The department held," he said. Claire kept typing. "I'm noting for the record that triage management during the intake phase was handled well." The words came out slightly unnatural, like a sentence someone had assembled carefully in advance, and was now reading from internal cue cards. Claire understood what it was. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a full acknowledgement. It was the smallest possible concession that was still technically a concession. And she had lived long enough and done enough difficult things that she didn't need to make it larger than it was. "Thank you," she said, without inflection. He stood there for another second, as if he'd expected more resistance and didn't know what to do with its absence. Then he straightened up and walked away. Priya, from across the station, made eye contact with Marcus. Marcus made a face that meant I saw it. Priya's face meant, it's not enough. They were both right, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so out loud because there was still work to do. The family members started arriving around 1 in the afternoon. The waiting area had been managed all morning by a patient liaison team and a social worker named Deb Forsyth, who had handled the organized chaos of mass casualty family coordination with the specific competence of someone who had done it before and didn't waste energy being dramatic about it. But as the acute phase wound down and families began transitioning from terrified waiting to demanding information, the emotional temperature in the waiting room climbed. A man named Gerald Hess arrived at the ER desk at 1:15 asking about his wife. She'd been on the overpass. She'd called him from the scene, barely coherent, and then the call had cut out. He'd driven to 3 hospitals before arriving at Riverside. He was 62 years old, and he was holding himself together with what was clearly a significant effort, the kind of effort that's visible in the jaw and the hands and the way a person breathes. The desk clerk found the name in the system. Patricia Hess, serious, Bay 11, stable as of the last update, and told him she was here and that someone would come speak with him. Nobody came for 11 minutes, because everyone was still managing patients. Gerald Hess sat in the waiting area for 11 minutes, and then stood up and walked through the ER doors, which were propped open because of the volume of foot traffic, and started down the bay corridor looking for his wife. Claire nearly ran into him at the corridor intersection. She looked at him, registered him, the age, the controlled panic, the searching eyes, before he said anything. "Bay 11, she said. "Patricia Hess. She's stable. Fractured collarbone and lacerations, respiratory irritation from the vapor exposure, but she's responding to treatment. She's awake." The man's face did something complicated. How did you know? You're the only person in this hallway who isn't staff. Come with me." She walked him to Bay 11. She pulled the curtain back. The woman in the bed, Patricia, 58, with a bandaged shoulder and a cannula delivering oxygen, looked up and said his name in the voice of someone using the last reserves of composure they have, and Gerald Hess sat down in the chair beside her and took her hand and said nothing at all, which was enough. Claire pulled the curtain back into place. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Not long. 3 or 4 seconds, just enough to take a breath, just enough to let the weight of the morning exist for a fraction of a moment outside her body before she compressed it back down and kept moving. It was the only moment all day she let herself feel any of it. At 2:20 p.m., Sandra called a department leadership meeting. In the small conference room adjacent to the administrative offices, she sat at the head of the table with a personnel file open in front of her, Claire's, and a legal pad filled with her handwritten notes, and she looked at the 3 people in the room with her. Ethan Cross, the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Lenora Vance, who had arrived on site at noon and had been quietly gathering information ever since, and the head of human resources, a man named Phil Greer, who had not yet been told the full shape of what he was there for. "We need to talk about the reassignment request," Sandra said. Cross said carefully, "The situation this morning doesn't necessarily—" "I'm not asking for input yet," Sandra said. She said it without sharpness, with the measured authority of someone who has decided what this meeting is going to be. "I'm going to describe what I observed this morning, and then we're going to talk about what that means for the decisions that were in process." Cross closed his mouth. Lenora Vance, who was 61 and had run medical departments for 2 decades and had not gotten there by misreading rooms, settled back in her chair and watched Sandra with the expression of a person who has just correctly identified which way things are going. Sandra opened her legal pad. She was 3 minutes into her account, clear, factual, with specific times and specific observed actions, when Phil Greer started taking notes. Cross's jaw tightened incrementally with each item she read. He hadn't known she'd been writing it down. He hadn't known anyone was writing anything down. He had been managing a department in crisis, which was genuinely difficult and which he had done with real competence, and he had counted on the chaos of the morning to remain unresolved, fluid, impressionistic, the kind of event that people remember in broad strokes, but not in the specific sequences that create accountability. Sandra Okafor had written down the specific sequences. At 11:03, she read, Bennett identified altered mental status in patient Hess, she used the Bay designation number, and called for imaging over the attending's initial assessment. Imaging confirmed intracranial bleed. Patient transferred to surgical at 11:47. Vance wrote something on her own pad. At 10:19, Sandra continued, Bennett redirected agency nursing staff on chemical burn protocol, correcting treatment application before physician review. Outcome, no secondary tissue damage. Oops, Cross said. That's within nursing scope. I'm aware of scope, Sandra said. I'm establishing pattern. She turned a page. At 9:51, following the identification of Bennett by Colonel David Marsh, U.S. Army Special Operations Command, she let that land for a second. I contacted the hospital's military liaison office to request verification of her service record. I received a call back at 12:08. The room was quiet. Bennett holds the rank of Major, Inactive Reserve, with a service record that includes 3 combat deployments and certification in Advanced Trauma Life Support, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, and Mass Casualty Incident Command. She received the Army Commendation Medal and, Sandra looked at the page, the Soldier's Medal, which is awarded for acts of heroism not involving direct contact with an enemy. Phil Greer had stopped taking notes. He was just looking at her. She listed her military experience on her application, Sandra said. The section is on page 3 of the standard form. Under prior medical experience, she wrote, Military Medical Service, 8 years, multiple deployment contexts. It was in the file when the hire was reviewed. The implication settled into the room slowly, like water finding level. Ethan Cross had reviewed that file. Everyone at the table knew it. He had reviewed it and hired her, and then spent 8 months systematically undermining her, and the basis of that undermining had been a judgment about her capacity for pressure, for high stakes, high-volume emergency medicine. That was not only wrong, but was wrong in a direction that should have been prevented by the most basic reading of her record. Vance said very quietly, Ethan. Cross said nothing. The reassignment request, Vance said. Your formal recommendation. Is it your position that it should proceed? The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. No, he said finally. It's not. Good, Vance said. The meeting continued, but the center of gravity had already shifted. Phil Greer was writing again, and what he was writing now had a different character than notes. It had the shape of documentation, of process, of the formal beginning of something that would need to be tracked carefully going forward. Cross sat at the table and participated and said the right things in the right order, but there was a quality to his stillness that Lenora Vance recognized. She had seen it before, in other people, in other rooms, at the moment when a person begins to understand that the ground under them has changed in ways they cannot immediately calculate. He had spent 8 months building a case against Claire Bennett, and this morning, in front of the entire emergency department, in front of a colonel, and 3 military officers and 30-some nurses and residents and staff, Claire Bennett had run a mass casualty response. Had run it, not assisted, not supported, but run it, with the precision and authority of someone who had done it in conditions that made this ER look manageable. The case he had built was still there in the file, but now it was sitting next to something else. At 3:45 p.m., the day shift had been on for hours, and the worst of the surge was metabolizing into the long, grinding work of patient stabilization, family communication, and the institutional documentation that followed any mass casualty event. The department was loud in a different way now, steadier, more rhythmic, the sound of a machine working rather than a machine under threat. Claire was charting at the nursing station when Marcus came and sat in the chair next to her. He didn't say anything for a moment. She kept typing. My brother was in the Marines, he said finally. She glanced at him. 2 deployments. He doesn't talk about it much. Marcus looked at the counter. I always wondered what it was like, that kind of training, that kind of whatever it does to how you think. Claire saved her chart and opened the next one. It makes you faster. Faster at what? At knowing what's survivable and what isn't. She typed a few lines. You stop wasting time on the things that aren't. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Is that why you didn't fight back? Against Cross? She stopped typing. She looked at the screen, not at him, and when she spoke, her voice was level but not cold. It wasn't survivable yet, she said. The conditions weren't right. There was no point. And now? She looked at him then, just briefly, and there was something in her expression that wasn't satisfaction exactly, but was adjacent to it in the way that resolution sometimes feels. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just real. Now the conditions are different, she said. She went back to her chart. Marcus stayed in the chair beside her for a few minutes, not saying anything, which was, she thought, the right thing for him to do. At 4:10 p.m., Lenora Vance walked onto the ER floor. She didn't come to the nursing station. She came to Claire directly, which was itself a departure from the usual channels. The CMO didn't typically walk across the floor to address nursing staff without going through department leadership first. The directness of it was deliberate and visible, and the 2 or 3 staff members who noticed it understood what they were seeing. Bennett, Vance said, when you have a moment. I have one now, Claire said. Vance looked at her with the particular assessment of someone taking a careful measurement. The colonel is still here. He's asked us to provide a meeting space through tomorrow morning. They want to begin the debrief tonight if possible. I've authorized it. I also want you to know that the human resources file is under review. Claire said, okay. The reassignment request is suspended. Okay? Vance studied her. You're not going to ask what that means for your position? I know what it means. What does it mean? Claire looked at her evenly. It means we're not done yet. Vance made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a different kind of recognition, the sound of someone who has just confirmed something she'd suspected. No, she said. We're not. She walked back toward the administrative corridor. Cross was standing at the far end of the nursing station. He had seen the exchange. He had seen Vance walk directly to Claire, had seen the conversation, had read the body language of a CMO who was not delivering pro forma reassurances, but was making a specific statement about position and priority. He understood what it meant. He picked up his radio. He was going to page the charge nurse about a patient. A legitimate reason to be on his radio, a real task. But his hand was slightly unsteady, and when the charge nurse answered, he had to repeat himself, because the first time the words came out wrong. At 4:47 p.m., Claire finished the last of her immediate charting, handed off to the incoming evening shift nurse with a thorough and precise verbal report, and walked to the locker room. She changed back into civilian clothes. She sat on the bench in the empty room for a moment, not moving, just breathing in the particular way she had learned to breathe after long operations. The deliberate regulation of something that had been compressed and contained for hours and needed to decompress slowly, not all at once. She checked her phone. There were 11 missed calls, none of them from anyone she needed to call back tonight. There was a text from Priya that said only, "You better not be alone right now," and then immediately after, "Never mind, I know you are. Eat something." She put her phone in her bag and stood up. She was halfway to the door when it opened. Phil Greer, from HR, stood in the doorway. He was holding a folder and had the expression of someone who has been asked to deliver news and has thought carefully about how to do it. "Ms. Bennett, do you have a few minutes? Is this about the reassignment?" "Partially." He held the folder. "And partially about something else. Dr. Vance has asked me to initiate a review of some personnel matters related to the emergency department." He paused. "Multiple personnel matters." Claire looked at him for a moment. "How long have the complaints been in the system?" she asked. Greer's expression shifted slightly. "I'm not... approximately." He closed his mouth. Then, carefully, "Some of them go back 14 months. 14 months. Before her hire. Before any of this. Complaints that had been filed and suppressed or ignored or buried in the administrative sediment of a department run by a man whose performance metrics were strong enough to insulate him from accountability for the things underneath. "Who filed them?" she asked. "I can't disclose that yet. The review is, was it Sandra? Another shift in his expression, smaller this time. But there. Claire said, okay, and walked past him into the corridor. The consultation room at the end of the hallway had a light on. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could see Colonel Marsh at the table, working through documents, one of his officers on a laptop beside him. She could also see, reflected in the glass of that window, the figure of Ethan Cross emerging from the stairwell behind her. He didn't see her standing there. He was walking toward the administrative offices, head down, moving with the tight, purposeful stride of a man who has a destination in mind and is thinking hard about how to get ahead of something. He turned the corner before he reached her, and she watched his reflection until it disappeared. She turned and looked at the corridor where he'd gone. Somewhere in the administrative offices, there was a file with his name on it. There were other files, too. 14 months of documented complaints that had been quietly buried in a department that should have known better and hadn't. And in the consultation room at the end of the hall, a colonel from Special Operations Command was waiting to put her name into the congressional record. The building knew things now that it hadn't known this morning. The question was what it was going to do with them. Claire pushed open the consultation room door. Marsh looked up from his documents. One of his officers closed a laptop. The other reached for a recorder. "Whenever you're ready," Marsh said. She sat down across from him, put her hands flat on the table, and said, "Start at the beginning." What she didn't know, what none of them in the room knew, was that down the hall, in the office of the chief medical officer, Lenora Vance had just opened an email that had come in 47 minutes ago, flagged urgent, from the State Medical Licensing Board. And the name at the top of the subject line was not Claire Bennett's. The email had been sent at 3:58 p.m., 49 minutes before Vance opened it. The subject line read, "Formal complaint. Dr. Ethan Cross, Riverside Medical Center, Ashford. Request for expedited review." The sender was the State Medical Licensing Board's Office of Professional Conduct, and the body of the email contained a single paragraph explaining that the board had received a consolidated complaint package, 11 individual submissions compiled by an outside patient advocacy organization, and that given the volume and specificity of the allegations, the board was initiating a preliminary inquiry and requesting the hospital's cooperation. 11 complaints. Not one. Not the standard isolated grievance that departments absorbed and managed and quietly resolved. 11 from 11 different people, compiled by an organization that had done the work of gathering them, which meant someone had been working on this for longer than today. Vance read the email twice. Then she picked up her phone and called Phil Greer, who was still in the hallway outside the locker room and who answered on the first ring. "Close your door," she said, "and tell me how many internal complaints we have on Cross in the personnel system." A pause. She heard him moving. A door. "I'd have to pull the file. Pull it now." Another pause. Longer. The sound of a computer waking up, a password entered, a database loading. Vance waited. She was looking out her window at the parking structure, and she was thinking about 14 months, which was what Bennett had said, and she was thinking about the gap between what a system is supposed to do and what it actually does when the person at the center of the complaints controls the room. 7, Greer said. 7 internal. 3 are from nursing staff, 2 from residents, 1 from a patient family, 1 from... He stopped. "From who?" "From Sandra Okafor. Filed 8 months ago." Vance closed her eyes for a moment. Was Cross notified? He would have been, under standard protocol. Was he notified or wasn't he? He was. Greer's voice had the particular careful quality of a man watching the floor drop out from under a policy he'd administered without questioning. The file shows a response letter was sent to him. There's no record of a formal hearing or a corrective action plan. 7 internal complaints, 11 external. Sandra had filed 8 months ago, the same month Bennett had been hired, which meant Sandra had seen the pattern coming and had tried to stop it through the proper channel, and the proper channel had absorbed the complaint and sent a letter and done nothing else. "Get legal on the phone," Vance said. "Don't talk to Cross yet. And Phil," she paused, "find out who was responsible for the review process on those internal complaints. I want names." She hung up. She sat still for exactly 6 seconds, which was as long as she allowed herself. And then she stood up and walked back out onto the floor. In the consultation room, Claire was 40 minutes into her debrief with Marsh when her phone buzzed on the table. She'd silenced it before sitting down, but she'd left the screen visible, a habit from years of being someone who needed to stay reachable in situations where staying reachable mattered. She glanced at it. The text was from Sandra. Need you. Conference room B. Now, if you can. She looked at Marsh. I need to step out. He looked at the phone and then at her. How long? I don't know yet. He nodded once. She was already standing. Conference room B was adjacent to the administrative wing, a narrower room than the consultation space, with a whiteboard on one wall and a table that seated 6. Sandra was there. So was Vance. So unexpectedly was Dr. Yusuf Bakr, still in scrubs, sitting with both forearms on the table and an expression that suggested he had been asked something recently and had decided to answer it honestly, regardless of the consequences. Claire came in and closed the door. Sit down, Sandra said. What happened? The licensing board contacted us. Vance's voice was precise and controlled. External complaint package. 11 submissions. It arrived this afternoon. Claire sat. Bakr came to me an hour ago, Sandra said. He had something he wanted to document. Claire looked at Bakr. He was 28, and he looked tired in the layered way of someone who had run a mass casualty response on insufficient sleep and was now sitting in a room processing something else entirely. He met her eyes without flinching. 3 weeks ago, he said, Cross told me not to order a specific imaging sequence on a patient in Bay 2. 46-year-old male presenting with abdominal pain and elevated heart rate post-minor MVA. I thought we should rule out aortic involvement. And he overruled you, Claire said. He said I was over-testing, running up costs, wasting imaging resources. He said the clinical picture didn't warrant it. Baker's jaw tightened. The patient was discharged. He came back 14 hours later by ambulance, grade 2 aortic injury. He went straight to surgery. The room was quiet. He survived, Bakr said. But it was... He stopped. It should have been caught the first time. Did you document the disagreement in the chart? Vance asked. I documented my assessment and his override. Yes. Why didn't you come to me then? Sandra asked. Baker looked at the table. Because Cross is the department chief and I'm a second-year resident, and I didn't think... He stopped again. I didn't think anyone would take it as seriously as the chart made it look. He meant, I was afraid. And the fear was reasonable, and it was exactly what Cross had been counting on for years, from residents and nurses and agency staff and anyone else without enough institutional standing to absorb the cost of pushing back. Claire had not been afraid. She had been patient, which was a different thing entirely. This goes into the licensing board package, Vance said. Tonight. Bakr nodded. Sandra looked at Claire. There's more. She opened the folder in front of her. The 3 nursing complaints in the internal file. I pulled the original submissions today. One of them describes a specific incident from 14 months ago before you were hired. A nurse named Rosa Teller, she doesn't work here anymore. She left 6 weeks after filing. Documented Cross overriding her clinical concern on a sepsis patient. The patient deteriorated. Cross's notes in the chart attributed the deterioration to a delayed nursing assessment. Sandra paused. He put it on her. In the official record. The precision of it landed in the room like a cold weight, not a dramatic explosion of wrongdoing, something quieter and more methodical. The systematic redirection of blame downward onto the people with the least power to defend themselves against a record that the most senior person in the room had written. He's been doing this for at least 14 months, Claire said. At minimum, Sandra said. We think longer. Some of the external complaints predate Rosa Teller. Claire looked at the folder. She thought about the way Cross had come after her. Specific, persistent, always in the register of professional critique rather than personal hostility, always technical enough to seem legitimate. She thought about what it would have cost someone without her background, without the particular quality of stillness that came from having survived things that made a hostile department chief feel manageable. She thought about Rosa Teller, who had filed a complaint and left 6 weeks later. She thought about what filing a complaint costs when no one follows through. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your account of this morning," Vance said. "Formal, documented, time-stamped. And anything from your 8 months in this department that speaks to a pattern." "I have it." Sandra looked at her. "You kept notes?" "I kept notes from the 3rd week." Claire met her eyes. "I didn't know when they'd be useful. I just knew they would be." Sandra held her gaze for a moment and then looked down at the folder, and something in her expression, not quite relief, something rawer than that, moved across her face and was controlled before it became visible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. Vance said, "I'm placing Cross on administrative leave pending the board review, effective tonight." "He'll contest it," Sandra said. "He's welcome to." Vance's voice was the voice of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing the texture of it. "I've already called legal." The meeting ended 9 minutes later. Vance went back to her office. Bakker went home finally, after Sandra told him twice that he needed to sleep. Sandra stayed. Claire was at the door when Sandra said her name. She turned. "I filed that complaint 8 months ago," Sandra said. "I want you to know that. I saw what he was doing to you, and I tried." Claire looked at her. "I know you did. It didn't work." "It's working now," Claire said. "That's how it goes sometimes." She meant it without bitterness. Sandra heard it that way and was quietly grateful, and also aware that gratitude wasn't adequate to what the morning had cost and what the next few days were going to require. Claire walked back to the consultation room. Marsh was on a call when she came in, standing with his back to the door, his voice low. One of the other officers looked up when she entered and then immediately looked at the table, which was the particular avoidance of someone who has just heard something and doesn't want to show it. Marsh ended the call and turned around. His face was not the controlled, neutral face of a man managing a routine debrief. It was the face of a man who has just learned something that changes the shape of what he came here to do. "Sit down," he said. "That's twice I've heard that in the last hour," Claire said. But she sat. Marsh put his phone face down on the table. He looked at her with the directness of someone who has decided to cut through the procedural framing they came in with. "The congressional inquiry," he said. "It's not just about the Callaway operation." She waited. "The committee has expanded its scope. They're looking at the full deployment record, all 3 rotations. There are allegations that some of the medical decisions made in the field were," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "unauthorized, outside sanctioned protocols." The air in the room changed. "Who made the allegations?" Claire asked. "I can't tell you that yet." "Was it someone on my team?" Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "The committee has subpoena authority. They're going to want to see everything: personnel records, field logs, treatment documentation." He paused. "Your testimony is going to matter more than we initially indicated." Claire held very still. Understood what he was telling her. Understood the architecture of it. The way that a congressional inquiry with expanded scope and unnamed sources was not a debrief anymore, was something more adversarial than that, was a proceeding in which she was no longer just a witness being called forward to clarify a record. She was potentially a subject. "When?" she asked. "The committee chair called 40 minutes ago. They've moved the hearing up." Marsh met her eyes. "Day after tomorrow, Claire. Washington, 7 a.m. briefing." She looked at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface, the way they'd been when she sat down 2 hours ago, and they were not shaking. They were very still, but in the stillness there was something that hadn't been there before. The particular quality of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on is not where they thought it was. "I'll need my service records," she said. "We have them." "All of them? Including the supplemental after action from the 3rd rotation?" Marsh didn't answer immediately. She looked up, and the expression on his face, the fraction of a second before he controlled it, told her everything she needed to know about which records were present and which ones were not. "Which records are missing?" Claire asked. Marsh didn't look away from her, which was itself an answer. A man who intended to deflect would have looked somewhere else. "The supplemental after action from Rotation 3 was filed through a different command channel. There was a classification review in progress. Some of the documentation was held." Held or removed? Held pending review. Colonel? Her voice was quiet and exact. Those records contain the treatment logs from the Varela extraction. They document every decision I made and why I made it. If the committee is calling my protocols into question and those records are not in front of them, then they're building a case on an incomplete record. You know what that looks like. Marsh said, I know what it looks like. Then fix it. It's not that simple. The classification review is it protecting operational security or is it protecting someone's account of what happened? The pause that followed was 4 seconds long enough to be its own kind of answer. I'll make calls tonight, Marsh said. You'll make them now, Claire said, because if I'm sitting in front of a congressional committee day after tomorrow and those records aren't in the room, I'm not testifying. And you can explain to the committee chair why the only person who was actually there isn't talking. It wasn't a bluff. Marsh could see that. She wasn't posturing or negotiating. She was describing a line she had already drawn, and the line was real, and it had the particular solidity of something that comes from knowing exactly what you did and why you did it and being entirely willing to stake everything on that clarity. He picked up his phone. He made the call in the hallway. Claire stayed in the room. Through the narrow window, she could see him pacing, one hand in his pocket, speaking with the contained urgency of a man working up a chain of command in real time. One of the other officers, the captain, was watching her with an expression she recognized, the slightly recalibrated attention of someone who came in with one understanding of the person in front of them and is now operating with a different one. She'd seen that look a lot today. Marsh came back in 12 minutes later. He sat down. The records will be submitted to the committee by 8 a.m. tomorrow, he said. The classification review is being expedited. What changed? I reminded the reviewing authority that incomplete records in a congressional proceeding create liability that doesn't go away. And that was enough? It was enough tonight. He looked at her. There are people who would prefer those records stayed held. I know, she said. I've known that for 2 years. He studied her for a moment. Is there anything in them that's going to create problems for you? She met his eyes steadily. There's everything in them that explains exactly what I did and exactly why every patient I treated that rotation survived. If that creates problems for someone, it won't be me. Marsh looked at the table. Something in his posture shifted, not softening exactly, but settling like a structure that has confirmed its own load-bearing points. We'll reconvene at 6 tomorrow morning, he said. Prep session before Washington. Fine. She stood. Get some sleep, Colonel. You look like you've been up since before the helicopters landed. He almost smiled. Not quite. So have you. I'm used to it, she said, and meant it in more directions than one. What? She didn't sleep much. That wasn't new. She lay in the narrow bed in the on-call room Sandra had quietly arranged for her. The hotel Marsh's team was using was 40 minutes away, and she wasn't driving 40 minutes at 11 p.m. after a day like this one. And she stared at the ceiling in the particular dark of a hospital at night, which was never fully dark and never fully quiet. And she thought about the Varela extraction. She hadn't thought about it in a sustained way in months. She'd packed it into the same internal space where she kept the other things that were finished and couldn't be changed, and that didn't benefit from being turned over repeatedly. But tonight, it came back with the specific clarity of something that has been waiting for a reason to surface. Marcos Varela had been an intelligence asset, extraction priority, injured in a vehicle ambush 40 kilometers from the nearest surgical facility. The injuries were significant: penetrating abdominal trauma, early signs of peritoneal contamination, blood pressure dropping in a way that said he had maybe 4 hours before the math became irreversible. The sanctioned protocol for that scenario was evacuation and field stabilization only, no surgical intervention without a physician present. There was no physician present. There was Claire, and there was a team medic named Ortega, and there was the kit, and there was Varela bleeding on a tarp in a bombed-out building while outside the perimeter was not fully clear. She had done what she knew how to do. She had done it fast and without the paperwork that normally preceded it, and when the helicopter finally arrived 2 hours later, Varela was alive and had been alive continuously, which was the only outcome that mattered to her. The sanctioned protocol, followed exactly, would have produced a different outcome. She was certain of that. She had been certain of it at the time, which was why she'd made the call she made. Someone, somewhere in the chain, had apparently decided that her certainty was the problem. She understood the logic. The military ran on protocols because protocols produce predictable outcomes, and predictable outcomes were what command structures could account for. A medic who improvised outside sanctioned parameters, even successfully, created a precedent that was difficult to contain. If the improvisation worked, it suggested the protocol was insufficient. If it failed, someone had died outside the rules. Either way, the institution was exposed. She had known all of this when she made the call. She had made it anyway. At 5:47 a.m., she gave up on sleep, dressed, and went to find coffee. The prep session with Marcia's team ran from 6 to 8:30. By the end of it, Claire had walked through the Varela case in more detail and more sequence than she had articulated to anyone since the debrief immediately following the extraction. She was precise. She was unemotional about it, which the captain, his name was Reeves, she'd learned, initially seemed to interpret as detachment, until he realized that the precision itself was the emotion, that what he was looking at was someone who had metabolized the experience into absolute clarity because that was how she processed things that mattered. The committee chair will push on the authorization question, Marsh said. He's going to ask why you didn't wait for physician clearance. Because the physician was 40 kilometers away and Varela had 4 hours. He'll say the protocol exists for a reason. The protocol exists to prevent harm. Following it would have caused harm. Those two facts are in tension, and I resolved the tension the way anyone with clinical judgment and a conscience would resolve it. He won't accept that framing. Then he'll have to explain to the record why the patient lived. Marsh looked at her across the table. You're not worried about this. It wasn't entirely a question. She answered it anyway. I'm not worried about what I did. I'm concerned about what's being built around it. What do you think is being built? I think someone in that command chain made a decision after the fact that the cleanest way to close the liability question was to suggest my judgment was the anomaly rather than the protocol. And I think that someone has had 2 years to make that narrative coherent. She paused. What I don't know is who. Marsh said nothing. You know who, she said. I have a strong suspicion, he said. I can't confirm it until I see the committee's evidence list. When do you get that? This morning, before we fly. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and put it back down. Reeves stood, without being asked, and went to refill it. Small thing. She noted it. Back at Riverside, the morning shift arrived to a department that felt different, in the way that places feel different after the thing that defines them has happened. The mass casualty event was 24 hours behind them, which in ER time was geological. The department had absorbed it, documented it, and moved on to the next set of patients, because that was the only gear emergency medicine had. But the other thing, Cross, the complaints, the administrative leave, that was still moving, still accumulating consequence, still visible in the particular quality of silence that settled over the nursing station when his name came up. He had been notified at 7:30 the previous evening. Vance had done it herself, in her office, with Phil Greer present as a witness. She had used careful, formal language. Administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal review in coordination with the state licensing board. And Cross had listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years being the authority in rooms and was now sitting in front of authority that wasn't his and didn't respond to the tools he had. He had said, at the end, "This is retaliatory." Vance had said, "The complaints predate your recommendation regarding Bennett by 14 months. I'd encourage you to review the timeline before making that argument to legal." He had nothing to say to that. He left. The word had moved through the department by morning, not officially, not through any announcement, but in the way these things always moved, person to person, in the specific register of people processing something they'd suspected for a long time and were only now permitted to say out loud. Marcus heard it from Terrence Flood. Priya heard it from Sandra. By the time the day shift was fully staffed, the shape of it was known. Cross was out, at minimum temporarily, and the review was real and had teeth. The reactions divided along a line that had always existed but hadn't been visible. Some staff, mostly senior attendings who had worked alongside Cross for years and whose relationship with him was professional and functional and who hadn't been targets, were cautious. They used words like process and premature, and let's see what the review shows. This was not dishonest exactly. It was the response of people who had not been in the rooms where the smaller cruelties happened, and who needed the formal record to tell them what the nursing staff had known for over a year. Others, Priya, Marcus, Bakker, Terrence Flood, 2 agency nurses who had worked enough shifts to have formed an opinion, were quieter than the occasion might have seemed to warrant, because what they felt wasn't triumph exactly. It was closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of people who were right for a long time before anyone with authority agreed with them. Sandra spent the morning in a series of meetings she described to no one in detail. At 10:15, the first development arrived in a form no one had anticipated. Rosa Teller called. She called the hospital's main line and asked for Sandra Okafor, and when Sandra picked up, the woman on the other end had the voice of someone who had been watching news she'd hoped to one day hear and had spent the morning deciding whether to make this call. She had left Riverside Medical Center 11 months ago, 6 weeks after filing a complaint that went nowhere, and had taken a position at a smaller hospital 2 hours away. She was a good nurse. She had hated leaving. She had left because staying had become untenable in a way she couldn't sustain. I saw it in the notifications, she said. The licensing board submission. Someone tagged it in a nursing forum. Her voice was careful. I have documentation. From the Callaway patient, the one I filed about. I have my own notes. I kept them because I thought someday I might need them. Sandra said, I'll have legal contact you today. Is she okay? Rosa asked. The nurse he went after this time, Bennett? Sandra paused. She's more than okay. A short silence. Good, Rosa said. I'm glad someone finally... She stopped. Okay. Have legal call. She hung up. Sandra sat at her desk for a moment with the phone still in her hand. Then she added Rosa Teller's name to the document she'd been building and called legal. At Riverside, in the records office on the second floor, a woman named Jean Ferris had been working quietly since 7 a.m. Jean was 63, had been in medical records for 24 years, and had the particular institutional memory of someone who had watched departments rise and fall and understood the administrative substrate of a hospital in ways that most clinical staff never needed to. She had been asked by Phil Greer the previous afternoon to pull every chart notation related to any adverse event in the emergency department over the past 18 months in which the attending physician's note attributed delayed outcome to nursing assessment. She had expected to find 4 or 5. She found 19. Not all of them were significant. Some were legitimate documentation of genuine delays. But she was experienced enough to read the language patterns in clinical charting, and what she saw across those 19 records had a consistency that was not coincidental. Specific phrasing that appeared across multiple charts, a particular construction that placed the language of nursing error in the record, while the language of physician decision-making remained technically clean. She had seen records manipulation before in her career, and she was careful about using the word because the word meant something serious, and the consequences of using it incorrectly were severe. But she pulled every chart. She flagged 19. She called Greer at 9:50. How many? He asked. 19 over 18 months. I want a physician review before I escalate this further. I'll get you a reviewer from outside the department. Make sure it's outside the department, she said. And Phil, I need this to go through legal directly, not through standard administrative review. What I'm looking at, if it's what I think it is not a process violation. Greer said, I understand. His voice had the tone of a man who wished he didn't. Claire landed in Washington at 11:40. The flight had been 45 minutes of Marsh reviewing procedural frameworks with her while Reeves took notes, and the third officer, a quiet woman named Lieutenant Sato, who said almost nothing and observed everything, tracked the documents on a tablet as they were confirmed received by the committee's administrative office. The supplemental after-action from Rotation 3 had arrived, as promised, at 7:58 a.m. Marsh had read it on the plane, which meant he was seeing parts of the operational record for the first time. He read without comment. When he finished, he put the tablet down on the tray table and looked out the window for a moment. The Varela extraction, he said. You documented a contraindication to the standard protocol. Yes. You documented it before you deviated. Yes. I noted in the field log that following the evacuation-only protocol would result in patient death before transport could be completed, cited the specific clinical indicators, and noted my intention to intervene surgically. The log has a timestamp. She paused. I did everything right, Colonel. I did it in the field, under pressure, before I acted, because I knew someone would eventually look at what I did, and I wanted the record to be clear. Marsh said, "Who would have seen that log?" "My supervising officer, the field command." She looked at him. "The same chain of command that held the records during the classification review." He absorbed that. "They held the records that cleared you. For 2 years." He was quiet for a long time after that. The committee hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. The afternoon was logistics, committee staff intake, document review, a session with the legal counsel assigned to support her testimony. The counsel was a woman named Andrea Foss, mid-40s, with the precise economy of movement that Claire associated with people who had spent significant time in high-stakes proceedings and had stopped wasting energy on anything non-functional. Foss read the Varela documentation in 35 minutes. Then she looked up. "This exonerates you completely." "I know." The committee chair's framing of the inquiry suggests he didn't know these records existed. Someone made sure they were hard to find. Foss looked at the tablet for another moment. "Do you know who?" "I have a name in mind. I don't have direct evidence." "If it comes out in the hearing, it'll come out," Claire said. "Someone built a case on an incomplete record. The record is now complete. Whatever they built won't hold." Foss studied her with the particular attention of a lawyer encountering a witness who understands exactly what they're sitting in. "You've thought about this for 2 years." "I've thought about it carefully," Claire said. "Not obsessively. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Obsession looks backward. I was waiting for the right time to move forward." Volk. Back in Ashford, at 2:30 p.m., Ethan Cross arrived at the hospital. He was not supposed to be there. Administrative leave meant no patient contact, no department access pending review. He had been explicitly told this by Vance and by legal. He came anyway, through the physician entrance, using his key card, which had not yet been deactivated because the deactivation request was in the queue and hadn't processed. He went to the records office. Jean Ferris was not at her desk. He didn't know she'd been there that morning. He went to the terminal and used his physician login, which also hadn't been deactivated yet, and pulled up the chart records interface. He was there for 11 minutes before security arrived. The security officer was a man named Dale Pruitt, who had worked hospital security for 16 years and who had been quietly informed by Sandra Okafor that morning that if Cross's keycard showed an access event, she wanted to know immediately. Dale had received the alert at 2:31. He was at the records office door at 2:42. "Dr. Cross," he said, "I need you to step away from the terminal." Cross turned. His face was controlled, but the control was working hard. "I'm reviewing patient records." "You've been placed on administrative leave. I need you to come with me. I have patients in this system who need..." "Doctor," Dale's voice was not unfriendly and was absolutely firm. "Please step away from the terminal." Cross stepped away. He went with Dale. He said nothing else in the corridor. But in the 37 seconds between when Dale's alert reached Sandra and when Dale physically entered the room, the system had logged every record Cross had accessed. Phil Greer had that log by 3 p.m. He looked at the list of charts. He looked at Jean Ferris's flagged list from the morning. Then he sat down heavily in his chair and called Vance. "He accessed 19 charts," Greer said. 11 of them are on Jean's flagged list." Vance said nothing for a moment. "He didn't modify anything," Greer said. "The access log shows opens and views, no edits. But Lenora..." He stopped. He knew which charts to look at. He went directly to them. The implication was precise and damning. He hadn't browsed. He hadn't searched. He had gone, in 11 minutes, directly to the records that documented the cases where his charting was most vulnerable, which meant he already knew which cases those were, which meant the pattern wasn't accidental and wasn't retrospective. He had always known. "Get legal on the phone," Vance said, "and call the licensing board directly. Tonight." Claire was in a hotel room in Washington when Sandra called her at 6:15. She listened. She asked 2 questions. Were the charts modified? And does legal have the access log? And when Sandra said yes to the second and no to the first, she said, "Good. Make sure the access log goes to the committee." "Already done," Sandra said. "Foss has it." A short silence. "Sandra?" "Yeah." "The woman who filed the complaint 14 months ago. Rosa, tell her. She should know what's happening." "I called her this afternoon," Sandra said. "She knows." Another silence. "Thank you for the complaint you filed 8 months ago." Sandra's voice, when she answered, was not entirely steady. "I should have pushed harder when it didn't go anywhere." "You did what you could with what you had," Claire said. "That's all anyone can do." She hung up. She ordered room service she barely tasted. She went over her testimony notes until 9 p.m. and then put them away, because what she was going to say tomorrow was not something that required more preparation. It required sleep and presence, and the same quality of focus she'd brought to the Varela extraction and to the mass casualty mourning, the quality of being entirely inside the moment with everything she had. She was asleep by 9:40. The committee room was larger than she'd expected, which was the only thing that surprised her. She sat at the witness table at 8:58 a.m. Marsh was in the gallery. Reeves. Foss was next to her, notepad open. The committee members filed in, 7 of them, which was a small subcommittee for a preliminary inquiry, and which told her something about the relative urgency assigned to this hearing before the expanded scope had been added. The chair was a man named Representative Alan Goss, 67, with the particular stillness of a politician who has run enough hearings to know that the preparation a witness brings to the table is visible within the first 2 minutes. He looked at Claire across the length of the table. She looked back. "Major Bennett," he said, "thank you for your service." "Thank you for having me," she said. It was exactly the kind of exchange that meant nothing on its surface and meant everything in its subtext. 2 people establishing, in 6 words each, the register they were going to operate in. Goss shuffled his papers. He looked at something on the page. He looked up. "I'd like to begin with the Varela extraction. Specifically, I'd like to understand the basis for your decision to perform a surgical intervention outside sanctioned protocol parameters." He paused. "Before we do that, however, I've been informed this morning that additional documentation has been submitted to this committee. Documentation that was previously under classification review." He looked up from his papers. "I've now had a chance to review it." He paused again, and in the pause there was something that wasn't quite discomfort, but was in that neighborhood. "Before we proceed, I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell me, in your own words, why this documentation was not part of the committee's initial evidence set." Claire looked at him steadily. "I'd like to know that too," she said. Goss looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the aide to his left, who leaned in and said something quiet. Then he looked at a specific document in front of him. Not the Varela after action, something else. Something that had arrived this morning along with the classified records and that Claire hadn't seen yet. His expression did something that was not quite readable from across a committee table, but that Foss beside her caught, because Foss leaned infinitesimally forward. "Major Bennett," Goss said. "Are you familiar with a Captain Dennis Harrow?" The name landed in Claire's chest like a hand pressing flat. Harrow, 3rd rotation, her supervising officer, the man who had filed the original protocol deviation report, the man whose name had been in the command chain that held the classification review for 2 years. "Yes," she said. Her voice didn't change. "Captain Harrow submitted a written statement to this committee 6 weeks ago," Goss said. "He is the source of the expanded inquiry." She had suspected. She had told Marsh she had a name in mind. But hearing it confirmed, in a committee room, by a congressional representative reading from a document, that was different from suspecting. His statement alleges that your intervention in the Varela case was not only unsanctioned but was specifically warned against by him in real time, that he instructed you not to proceed and that you proceeded regardless. Foss's pen stopped moving. "The supplemental records we received this morning," Goss continued, "include your field log from that night, time-stamped and unedited. It does not corroborate Captain Harrow's account." He looked at her. "In fact, it contradicts it in several specific and significant ways." Claire said nothing. "Major," Goss's voice had shifted. Not warmer, but different, the shift from investigator to something that occupied a more complicated position. Is there anything you would like to say, on the record, about Captain Harrow's statement? She looked at the table for a moment. Not long. Then she looked at Goss. He had 2 years, she said, and the records that proved him wrong. Goss looked at her. That's all I need to say about his statement, she said. The record says the rest. The room was very quiet, and then the aide to Goss's left slid another document across to him, something that had just come in, physically handed to the aide by a staff member who had entered through the side door while Claire was speaking, and Goss read it, and his face did something that hadn't happened yet in the 40 minutes she'd been in that room. It went uncertain. He looked at Claire. He looked at the document. He looked at the aide. We need to take a brief recess, he said. The recess lasted 19 minutes. Claire sat at the witness table and didn't move. Foss leaned close and said quietly, Do you know what's in that document? No, Claire said, but I know what it isn't. What isn't it? Anything that helps Harrow. Foss looked at her for a moment, then sat back and wrote something on her notepad and said nothing else. In the gallery, Marsh had his phone out and was reading something with the focused attention of a man receiving information he'd been waiting for. Reeves was watching him. Sato was watching the door the aide had come through. When the committee members filed back in, Goss sat down with the particular deliberateness of someone who has spent 19 minutes making a decision and has made it. He set the new document on the table. Major Bennett, he said, this committee has just received a communication from the Inspector General's office. It concerns Captain Dennis Harrow. He paused, not for effect, but for the specific pause of a man choosing his words in a way that will hold up to later review. Captain Harrow is currently under investigation by the Army Inspector General for falsification of official military records. The investigation was initiated 3 weeks ago based on a referral from within his own command. This committee was not informed of that investigation when his statement was submitted 6 weeks ago. The room was very still. That omission, Goss said, is something this committee will be addressing separately. He looked at the document, then at Claire. In light of the IG investigation, and in light of the supplemental documentation now in our possession, I am suspending the expanded inquiry into your conduct pending the outcome of that investigation. Your testimony today will be limited to the original scope, the Callaway operational record, which the documentation shows is straightforwardly supportive of your account. He looked up. I want to say on the record that the delay in making this documentation available to this committee represents a serious failure in process. That is not a comment directed at you. Claire said, I understand. Is there anything you want to add on the record about the events of the past 2 years? She thought about it for a moment. Not long. I made the right call in the field. I documented it in real time because I knew someone would eventually look at it. The patient lived. The record is accurate. She paused. I'd like to go home. Goss looked at her for another second. Something in his expression, not quite an apology, not quite admiration, but some compound of both, shifted briefly and was controlled. We'll conclude today's session. You're free to go. Donk. She walked out of the committee building into November air that was cold and clear and smelled like the city. Exhaust, concrete, something metallic from the river a few blocks west. Marsh came through the door 30 seconds behind her. Harrow? She said, without turning around. The IG referral came from Ortega, Marsh said. Ortega? The team medic, the one who had been in that building with her, hands bloody, working next to her for 2 hours while the perimeter held and the helicopter didn't come. He submitted a formal statement 8 weeks ago. Harrow's written account of that night directly contradicted Ortega's. Ortega kept his own field notes. Marsh paused. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. He just did it. Claire was quiet for a moment. She thought about Ortega, 24 years old during that rotation, from somewhere in New Mexico, who had a habit of chewing the cap of his pen when he was thinking, and who had said almost nothing during the extraction except exactly what needed to be said. She had not spoken to him since the deployment ended. She had not known he was watching. He kept his notes, she said. For 2 years, Marsh said, waiting. She understood that. She understood it completely. Tell him thank you, she said. Tell him I said it directly. I will. She turned around and looked at Marsh. He was standing in the cold in his uniform with his hands at his sides, and he looked, for the first time since the helicopters had landed at Riverside 2 days ago, like a man who had been carrying something and had set it down. "I owe you an apology," he said. "The records should never have been held. I should have pushed harder when I first heard about the review. You didn't know what was in them. I should have assumed they mattered." She looked at him steadily. "You made the calls last night. You got them released." She paused. "We're square, Colonel." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded, which was what he had instead of the kind of processing that required more words. "Car's waiting," he said. "Airport whenever you're ready." "Give me 10 minutes," she said. She walked half a block to a coffee cart on the corner and bought a cup she didn't particularly need and stood there on the sidewalk drinking it, watching the city move around her, people, cars, pigeons managing the concrete with their specific pragmatic energy. She wasn't doing anything exactly. She was just standing in the open air after 2 days inside institutional buildings, letting the cold sit on her face, letting the noise of the street be just noise. She thought about the hospital room in Ashford. She thought about the man with the crushed legs, and the woman with the intracranial bleed, and Gerald Hess sitting down next to his wife and taking her hand. She thought about Priya's text, "Eat something," and the cup of water put down without asking. She thought about Bakker, standing in that conference room at 19 hours into his shift, deciding to be honest regardless of what it cost him. She thought about Rosa Teller, who had filed a complaint that went nowhere and left, and who had kept her notes anyway. There was a pattern to all of it, and the pattern wasn't about her. It was about what people did when they saw something wrong, and the structure around them refused to confirm what they were seeing. Some people stopped trusting what they saw. Some people left. Some kept records in silence for a day they couldn't be certain would ever arrive. She finished the coffee. She went to the airport. Back in Ashford, things moved the way consequential things move in institutions. Not in one dramatic sweep, but in the accumulation of formal steps, each of which was mundane and procedural on its own surface and collectively amounted to something that couldn't be undone. The state licensing board's expedited review of Ethan Cross was upgraded to a formal investigation on the same morning Claire testified in Washington. The grounds cited were a pattern of documented adverse outcomes potentially attributable to physician decision-making attributed in the official record to nursing error, unauthorized access to medical records during a period of administrative leave, and a totality of circumstances suggesting conduct inconsistent with professional medical standards. Phil Greer notified Cross by phone as required. Cross said he was retaining legal counsel. Greer said that was his right. The call lasted 4 minutes. Gene Ferris's flagged chart review was completed by an outside physician reviewer, a trauma surgeon from a hospital 2 hours away who had no existing relationship with Riverside and whose analysis was therefore clean of institutional interest. She reviewed all 19 charts. She flagged 14 as containing documentation patterns that warranted further investigation. In 7 of those 14, her analysis was specific. The physician charting reflected a post hoc reconstruction of events that shifted clinical responsibility in ways inconsistent with the contemporaneous nursing notes. She submitted her report on a Thursday afternoon. The report was 22 pages. Vance read it in full that night, alone in her office after the building had mostly emptied. And when she was finished, she sat for a long time without doing anything in particular. 19 years in healthcare administration, and she still found it possible to be surprised by the specific shape that human failure took when it had enough structural protection to operate without friction. It wasn't that Cross was uniquely monstrous. It was that he was depressingly legible, a man whose competence was real and whose character had been given, for years, no serious resistance. The resistance had finally come from the places he'd least expected it. A nurse who wouldn't leave. A nurse manager who kept a legal pad. A young resident who decided one morning that he was tired of the cost of staying quiet. A woman who had filed a complaint a year ago and kept her own records when the complaint disappeared. A field medic in a different country who had written down what he saw. None of them had been in the right position to matter exactly until they were. Vance closed the report. She called legal. She asked them to prepare the documentation for the formal termination of Ethan Cross's employment at Riverside Medical Center, effective immediately, pending board approval. She expected no opposition from the board. She was correct. Claire landed back in Ashford on a Thursday evening and went directly home, which was a two-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from the hospital with a couch she'd had since Virginia and a kitchen she cooked in more than people expected. She unpacked, she showered, she made eggs because that was what she had, and she hadn't eaten since the airport. She had 11 texts and 6 voicemails, none of which she looked at until she'd eaten. Sandra had called twice. Marsh had sent a text that said, Harrow's IG investigation has been formally confirmed public. DOD issued a statement this afternoon. Thought you should know before you see it online. She looked that up. The statement was brief and institutional and used language that meant exactly what it said while carefully not saying more. Confirmed that an IG investigation into records management within the relevant command was underway, and that individuals subject to the investigation had been placed on administrative hold. Harrow was not named, but the structure of the thing named him to anyone paying attention. She read it twice and put her phone down and looked at the window. She didn't feel the thing she might have expected to feel. Not relief, exactly. Relief implied that she'd been carrying something heavier than she'd consciously acknowledged, and she'd been deliberate about not letting it get that heavy. What she felt was closer to the settling that happens when a long calculation finally closes. The numbers had come out right. She had known they would. She had needed to wait long enough for the right conditions. She washed her plate. She went to bed at 9:30. The public dimension of what happened to Cross arrived the following week, and it arrived the way public reckonings usually do, not as a single explosive moment, but as a series of official statements that accumulated into an unmistakable shape. The hospital issued a statement confirming that Dr. Ethan Cross had been terminated and that the matter had been referred to the State Medical Licensing Board. The statement used the language of procedure and accountability and expressed commitment to patient safety. It did not use the word pattern, but the licensing board's concurrent statement did. The licensing board issued a notice of formal investigation, which became a matter of public record. It listed categories of concern, which included, in the careful language of regulatory bodies, documentation practices, supervision of clinical staff, and conduct toward subordinate personnel. The notice was not a finding of guilt, but it was public, and it was specific, and it contained enough detail that anyone with knowledge of the context could read it clearly. Local news picked it up by Tuesday. The story ran on 2 regional outlets and 1 healthcare industry publication. It was not front-page news by any standard. It was a story about a hospital administrator placed on leave and a licensing investigation, which was the kind of story that mattered deeply to the people inside it and registered as a small item to everyone else. But inside Riverside Medical Center, it landed with the weight of something that had been a long time building and had finally broken the surface. The nursing staff read it. The residents read it. Agency staff who had done rotations at Riverside and left, some of whom had left specifically because of the climate in the emergency department, read it and texted people they still knew inside the building. Rosa Teller sent Sandra a text that said only "saw it." Sandra wrote back, "Saw it too." Priya found out from Marcus, who had been refreshing news alerts compulsively since Wednesday, and who said, when he told her, the thing in his voice that people have when they've been waiting for something so long, they're slightly surprised to feel its weight lift. "It's real," he said. "I know it's real," Priya said. "I just..." She stopped. Does she know? She knows. Did she... how does she feel? Marcus thought about it. "The same way she feels about everything," he said. "Like she already knew it was coming and she just waited for everyone else to catch up." Priya laughed, which was not entirely a happy sound, but had happiness in it. That's her." Claire came back to work on a Monday, 8 days after the mass casualty event, 4 days after Washington. She came in for the day shift, which she didn't usually do, and she wore the same scrub she always wore. And she came through the ambulance bay entrance instead of the main one because the parking was better and she wasn't performing anything. Terrence Flood saw her first. He said "Bennett" in a specific way, and she said "Flood" in the same register, and that was that. Marcus found her at the medication station 10 minutes into the shift and stood next to her without saying anything for long enough that she looked at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked at the wall. I just wanted to, you know. I know, she said. Okay. He handed her the chart he'd been holding, which was why he'd come over in the first place, and went back to his bay. Priya hugged her. It was brief and slightly awkward, because Priya moved fast and Claire was mid-step when it happened, and they both laughed at the geometry of it, and then Priya said, "You need to actually eat lunch today, I'm serious. I've been watching you run on coffee and whatever willpower is made of for a week." And Claire said, "I had eggs." And Priya said, "That was 4 days ago," which wasn't accurate but was close enough that Claire didn't argue. Bakker nodded to her from across the station. She nodded back. It was the right amount. Well, the meeting with Vance happened that afternoon at 4 o'clock in Vance's office, which was on the administrative floor and had a window that looked out over the hospital's central courtyard. Vance had a cup of tea. She offered Claire one. Claire took it, which was more of a social concession than a need, and sat in the chair across the desk. "The physician reviewer's report is complete," Vance said. "I know. 14 charts flagged for further investigation, 7 with significant documentation concerns." Vance looked at her. "I want you to know that those 7 patients, or their families, will be contacted. It's going to be a long process." "It should be," Claire said. Vance nodded. "It will be." She set her cup down. "I'm also here because I want to talk about your position. The reassignment is canceled." "Yes, it was never going to proceed," Vance paused. "But I'm not here about reinstating you to your previous role. I'm here because Riverside is going to build a new emergency response infrastructure. Mass casualty preparedness, triage protocol development, staff training. The events of last week made clear that this department was operating without adequate preparation for what actually happens to a trauma center in a large-scale incident." She looked at Claire steadily. "I want you to run it." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Not instead of nursing," Vance said. "This would be an additional role. Director of Trauma Preparedness. You'd build the program, design the training, run the simulations, set the standards. You'd still have clinical shifts if you want them. I suspect you'd want them." "I'd want them," Claire said. "Then that's how it works." Vance leaned back slightly. "You'd have actual authority, not an advisory title, real structural authority over emergency response planning." Claire looked at the window. The courtyard below had a few trees that had lost most of their leaves. The specific stripped-down honesty of November. No ornamentation, just the actual shape of things. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you've done it," Vance said. "Not in a simulation, not in a training program. You've run mass casualty response under conditions that make last week look manageable. And you've done it without resources, without hierarchy, without anyone telling you to. That's not something I can teach a department. That's something I can install in a department if I have the right person." Claire looked at her. "You're not doing this as compensation." "No," Vance said. "I'm doing it because it's the right operational decision." She paused. "The compensation piece is handled separately. Phil has numbers for you." The corner of Claire's mouth moved, slightly. "Okay," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." The formal acknowledgement happened 3 weeks later. It was not a ceremony in the traditional sense. Vance had asked Claire directly what she wanted, and Claire had said she wanted it to be a department meeting, not a public event, which Vance respected. So it was a department meeting. The ER staff gathered in the training room that usually held 40 and was now holding 63, with people standing along the walls and a couple of residents sitting on the floor near the projector because there weren't enough chairs. Vance spoke first. She described the mass casualty event with specificity and credited by name every person who had contributed to the outcome. She described Claire's role without euphemism and without the particular institutional language that makes things sound cleaner than they were. She said that 38 patients had arrived that morning and that all 38 were alive, and that this was not an accident, and that the specific decisions made in the first 47 minutes of that event were the reason. Then Sandra spoke. She talked about what she'd written in her legal pad and why, and what she'd observed over 8 months, and she used the word systematic to describe what had been done to the nursing staff in this department. And she said it clearly, in a room full of people, some of whom had experienced it, and some of whom had administered it by silence, and the room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Then Bakker spoke, briefly, about the decision he'd made to come forward, and about the patient who had survived and the patient who had almost not, and about what he wished he'd done 8 months earlier and what he was going to do differently going forward. He was 28 years old, standing in front of 60 people talking about failure, and he didn't make it smaller than it was, which was the right choice and clearly cost him something to make. Then Vance announced the new role: Director of Trauma Preparedness. The title, the scope, the structural authority. She said Claire would begin building the program in the new year and that her first initiative would be a department-wide mass casualty simulation designed from scratch based on the actual events of the morning that had exposed every gap they had. Someone in the back started clapping before Vance had finished the sentence. It spread. Claire was standing at the front of the room, and she did not look comfortable with it, which was the most honest thing about the moment. She was not a person built for standing still while people directed gratitude at her. Her jaw was slightly tight, and she was holding the edge of the table next to her with one hand, not visibly, just grounding. Priya, from 3 rows back, caught her eye and made a face that said, "Just let it happen." Claire made a face back that said, "I'm trying." When the room settled, Vance looked at her and said, "Anything you want to say?" Claire looked at the room, 63 people, some of whom she'd known for 8 months, most of whom she'd worked alongside in the compressed honesty of a crisis, all of whom were looking at her with something that ranged from respect to relief, to the specific warmth of people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side. She thought about what to say. She didn't have anything prepared. "The morning of the Hartwell incident," she said, "I watched a 28-year-old resident make correct calls for 40 minutes with no attending backup and no safety net, and he didn't freeze once." She looked at Bakker. "I watched nurses redirect their training in real time without being asked to. I watched a charge nurse coordinate ambulance communication while running family notification simultaneously." She looked at Terrence. What went right that morning wasn't one person. It was everyone deciding not to stop. She paused. What went wrong in this department for the past year and longer? That also wasn't one person. It was everyone deciding not to start. She said it without accusation, without the particular edge that would have made it a condemnation. It was just a fact, and it landed like one. That's what the training program is for, not to create heroes, to make it easier for people to start sooner. She let go of the table edge. "Thank you for still being here," she said. "All of you." The room was quiet for a moment. Not empty quiet, full quiet, the kind that holds something. And then it broke back into the sound of people, movement, the department beginning to reconstitute itself around the ordinary work of the afternoon. Ethan Cross's medical license was suspended 6 weeks later, pending the outcome of the formal investigation. The suspension was not permanent. These things rarely resolved in straight lines. But it was public, and it was real, and it meant that the department he had run with unchallenged authority for 6 years was no longer his to control in any form. The investigation would take time. There would be hearings, documentation reviews, formal proceedings that moved in the deliberate pace of regulatory bodies. Some of it would go in his favor. Some would not. The outcome wasn't certain, and wouldn't be for months. What was certain was the 14 charts, and Gene Ferris's 22 pages, and 7 patients whose records didn't say what actually happened to them, and a woman named Rosa Teller, who had filed a complaint and been ignored, and who was now a named participant in the licensing board's formal record. What was certain was that the structure that had protected him had been examined and found to be a structure, not a truth. Dennis Harrow's IG investigation concluded 60 days later with a formal finding of records falsification. He was reduced in rank and formally separated from service. The after-action report from the Varela extraction, the one that had been held for 2 years, the one that cleared Claire in full, was entered into the official military record without redaction. Ortega called her the day the finding was published. She picked up on the second ring. "I heard," she said. "I've had the notes for 2 years," he said. I needed to know someone was looking." "I know the feeling." A short pause. "You good?" "Yeah," she said. "You?" "Better now," he said. She smiled, which he couldn't see. "Good. Take care of yourself, Ortega. Yes, Major. She hung up and stood in her kitchen and looked out the window at nothing in particular. Outside, Ashford was doing what it always did. Moving, loud, the industrial corridor grinding along, the highway rebuilt and open, the overpass repaired with new safety barriers that hadn't been there before. Things changed slowly. Some things changed all at once. Most things were some combination of both, and the only way to tell the difference was to still be there when the change finally settled. She had been there. She had stayed. Not because it was easy, and not because she'd known exactly how it would resolve, and not because she was the kind of person for whom things worked out cleanly. She had stayed because the work was real, and the patients were real, and because leaving would have meant letting the distance between what was happening and what should be happening become permanent. And that was something she had never been able to do, not in a bombed-out building 40 kilometers from surgical help, and not in a fluorescent-lit emergency department where the danger was quieter, but the damage was just as real. Patience, she had told Marcus, wasn't the same as passivity. She had never explained the rest of it, the part where patience is just strategy wearing a different name. The part where staying still in a hostile environment requires more active effort than fighting, because fighting gives you somewhere to put the energy, and staying requires you to hold it. She had held it for 8 months, and she had done it without losing what mattered about herself, which was the part she was most uncertain about in the early weeks, and most clear about now. You didn't need to be perfect. You needed to be right about the important things, and document the rest, and outlast the people who were counting on you to disappear. 3 weeks into January, Claire stood in the empty training room that had been designated as the program's development space and looked at the blank whiteboard and the stack of binders Vance's office had assembled, and she thought about what she was going to build. She pulled the cap off the marker. She wrote one word at the top of the board, large enough to be readable from the back of the room. Gaps. Not goals. Not objectives. Not the aspirational language of institutional program documents that describe the future in terms of what would ideally be true. Gaps. The specific distance between where they were and where they needed to be. That was where you started. That was always where you started. She drew a line under the word and began writing. The room was quiet around her. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the department running, monitors, voices, the particular rhythm of an emergency unit in motion, the sound of work being done by people who were still there. She kept writing. She didn't know exactly what this was going to become. She didn't know which parts of the program would work and which would need to be rebuilt twice before they held. She didn't know what the next crisis would look like, or when it would arrive, or whether what she was building now would be enough to meet it. She knew how to start, and she knew how to stay. And she knew that both of those things, when most people were counting on you to have neither, were enough to change the shape of what a room could hold. She had proven it. She kept writing. There are people in every institution who see what's wrong before anyone with power does. They file the reports that go unanswered. They keep the notes that nobody asked for. They stay when staying costs them something real. They are not heroes in the way we usually use that word. They are not certain, and they are not fearless. And they are not waiting for the perfect moment because the perfect moment doesn't exist. They are just people who decided that the distance between what is and what should be was not something they were willing to make peace with. That decision, made quietly, held long enough, is how things actually change. It is the most ordinary and the most difficult thing. It is what courage looks like when it doesn't announce itself.